welcome to everybody to this public lecture, this ACEMS public lecture, to be given by Kerrie Mengersen from Queensland University of Technology. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. They've been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm aware that a lot of the rest of you will be sitting on land where the traditional owners are different, and there'll be people from all over Australia and indeed probably outside Australia listening to this. So I'd certainly like to extend those respects to the traditional landholders of wherever anyone is sitting listening to this. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Kerrie Mengersen today. Kerrie is one of the most distinguished, I guess you'd call her data scientist, statistician, quantitative all-rounder in Australia. She is a distinguished professor of statistics at Queensland University of Technology. She is a deputy director of ACEMS, and she's director of the Queensland University of Technology Centre for Data Science. So she's been very active in these fields. She's a fellow of both the Australian Academy of Science and the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. She's also a fellow of the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences. Kerrie's well known internationally as one of the most influential Bayesian statisticians going around. She has expertise in both Bayesian statistics and computational methods. And in particular, she's really known for her application of those ideas in various areas: health, the environment, industry, etc. So Kerrie's got a very intriguing title for her talk today, The Origami of Data Science. I'm looking forward to hearing from it. And so Kerrie, I'll hand over to you and invite you to give your presentation.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this session. It's an honour and a privilege. This is a great session for ACEMS, and the public lecture series is always one of my favourite presentations. So thank you. I want to acknowledge ACEMS and the ACEMS members and researchers. All the work that I'll be talking about has been done by others in our group here, and I'll make mention of them as we go along, and of all the contributors to that research as well. ACEMS has really been a fantastic vehicle for collaboration across the different nodes and across the different discipline areas. And so this work is born from that. And also acknowledge QUT and the support that we have from QUT in both ACEMS and also in statistical sciences here, and in the emerging field of data science. So why Origami of data science? So let's just start then with where origami came from. So origami actually is origami, means folding the paper. And so we take a piece of paper like this, and then we fold it. And so we'll be talking about how does a piece of paper like this, what does that have to do with data science? So if we think of origami, then it began in China, and the Chinese invented paper around 100 AD, and the invention spread to Japan around 600 AD. And from there, origami was begun. And the first book on origami actually came out then in 1797. And this was The Secret of 1,000 Cranes Origami. So take one crane like this, courtesy of Becky Cook. So this is one of the origami cranes, and then make these various replications of that into important objects. So you take a base, which might be your piece of paper, and then origami requires that you create some sort of base, and this is a kite base, sort of the simplest origami. And then you can also have a preliminary base, which would be some variation on that. And that can then be considered to be the same as a water bomb base. So many of us in our youth would have made something like a water bomb. And what's interesting about these two bases is that we have the preliminary base and the water bomb base as being interconvertible. So they actually are the same thing, just folded in different ways. And then there are variants that we add to that base. And so there's a whole lot of variants that we can add to the the base to make different kinds of shapes in origami. And so what we're going to do then is to take this piece of paper and somehow morph it into something that's a product like this. And that's the process of paper folding or origami. And so you can see here some of the spectacular kinds of products that can be made from this simple base, this simple paper. And if we even morph the space, then we might think about taking this piece of paper to making a person like our ACEMS director. And in particular, this kind of person might be one representation of Peter, and apologies to Peter, but this meant in good faith. But Peter might actually imagine, and many of us will imagine, that he should look like this. And so instead of having a product that would look like this same piece of paper could create our ACEMS director, Peter, as somebody like this, and you know, charging in front of the being the leader that absolutely Peter has been for ACEMS. You're welcome, Peter. And so we take, as I said, we take this paper and we can think about making an object. And this object can be beautiful in its own right, but it can also have a purpose. And so it has an impact. And of course, the crane has a very strong impact in being the symbol for peace in Hiroshima. And so, you know, this simple piece of paper turns into a product then that has a purpose or an impact. And so we take these products then, and just to give an idea of some of the products then with a purpose or an impact, we can make a folding kayak. I'm still getting that together. I'm still up to the crane, but one day we'll get to the folding kayak. And you can see here amazing, spectacular origami pieces. And we can even think of going the other direction from a product to paper. So we have now something that's quite complex in nature, and then that is then translated to something in a 2D space effectively, which is a piece of paper. And so we can also think of new material that can be built, so things that are created that are new from origami. So we take our piece of paper then, and we're going to fold it into something quite complicated in space. And so we think about this as sort of folding space, if we like. And if we think about going in the opposite direction, we have something that's quite complicated, and then we think about what's its intrinsic dimension, what's its, when we unfold it, then what do we end up with as being the canonical dimension of that object? And so if we think about that in statistical terms, then we can think about taking these objects in space and how we find then their intrinsic dimension. And so this is work with Antonio de Mira and colleagues in Europe, and also Edgar Santos Fernandez here at QUT. So we can think about then the intrinsic dimension as being like the lower bound of a dimension of an image or an object or a data set, as being like the measure of the complexity of the data set or the signal. And so this is used then in pattern recognition, it's used in signal processing, it's used in estimation. And so we go from origami then to what we might think about in statistics as what is the dimension reduction here. So one way that we can think about intrinsic dimension then is to think of it like this. We have some data sampled from some density that's going to be defined on the manifold. So that's the space that we have, our object, and this has got unknown intrinsic dimension. So we might take our crane here and think about what is the unknown intrinsic dimension of this object here. It's defined on this manifold, this 3D manifold, and what's its intrinsic dimension. Now that intrinsic dimension is going to be denoted by D. And so we can figure that out if we're in a space of data, that we take the distance from each data point to its first neighbor and then to its second neighbor. So the closest other data point, and then the second closest data point. And if we take the ratio of those two distances, we end up with a distribution that we know. So those ratios then will have a Pareto distribution, and the parameter of that Pareto distribution can be defined as that D is the dimension, the intrinsic dimension of that data set. So it tells us how close points are and how far away points are, and what's the sort of the complexity of that data set. Now, if we assume that those those ratios that we're going to denote by mu, assuming they are independent, then we can write down that Pareto distribution. And we can think about that as a mixture of Paretos if we have some heterogeneity in space. And so this representation then is of having different kinds of complexity over the space. And we'll then be wanting to estimate those, the parameters D in our model here, and also the mixture components. And so what we end up with is going from something that's a complex space to having a mixture distribution over it. So we're going to have these different kinds of intrinsic dimensions over the space that we have. So in a simulation study then, if we show this, then we can take, for example, 5 Gaussian distributions with different dimensions from 1 to 1, 2, 4, 5, and 9. We draw from those Gaussian distributions, and then we apply this approach to try to regain that intrinsic dimension. So over the space then, what is the intrinsic dimension? And you can see here that we do a pretty good job of being able to recover those different clusters, if you like, or those subgroups. So we're going from this quite complex set of data to then understanding what the different bases are in space. So this is an example that Edgar worked on here, which is in sport. And so what's the intrinsic dimension then of a game, of a sports game? So this is in basketball. And what we're interested in here is to be able to understand how the different play moves across the basketball game as the game evolves. So we have video tracking data here, and we want to understand how the team is behaving as the game proceeds, and in particular about shots for goal here. So if we look at this then, we want to understand then the variation within the play, so the ID evolution on the movement, the distance and the trajectories over space and time. We want to understand the difference between plays, and we also want to understand differences between the games. And so if we think about, for example, home and away games, then we can have the field shots taken when the home team is attacking and when the other team is attacking. We can then think about the number of columns and rows in our data, and we set that up. And so now we're in sort of 20-dimensional space, and we want to actually understand then what is the intrinsic dimension? What's the complexity? What's the underlying base in this kind of play? And so the results then show, here's an example, as the play moves, we can identify then the intrinsic dimension, that the change in the intrinsic dimension or the complexity in this play. So as a result, and Edgar, I'm sure, can enlarge on this in a separate presentation, but we might have 3 players in the ball, and you can see how the different players move across the space, and we can get a heat map then of the movements and also the intrinsic dimension that's happening or changing as time goes on. So we can see, for example, different results in the intrinsic dimension. So the teams that won versus the team that lost. We can look at the home game versus the away game. We can look at different plays, and we can understand then how this sort of complexity or unexpectedness in the play is evolving. So that's an example of how we do this sort of folding. We go from a paper to a product, and then from a product to a paper, thinking of it in terms of statistics. So if we go back then to thinking about origami and statistics, we have our paper, which is like our data. We have our base then that we apply, which is like our our conceptual framework. We then have a variation on that, which will be our model or our description. It's the variation on that base. And then we can think about folding as the analysis that we would do. And then we can think, if we're looking at morphing the space, then about the intrinsic dimension. And finally, looking at the product or the package that we might write, or the software that we create, or the tool that we create, or the knowledge that we create as being the product. And then we have the purpose. So why are we doing this? So if we think about then, as in statistics, we think about having our base. And so for me, the typical base would be our Bayesian framework. And so we want to update our existing understanding about an unknown given new data. And we take our unknown as theta, and we take our new data as x. And so we're going to update our understanding about theta, and that's going to be proportional to our prior understanding about theta, and then the influence of the new data. You'll see here that I've also included M, which is our model, because we can also then include the model as well, and update the model in the same way as we could think of it as a parameter. And so what we end up with then is this base then that, for example, Nate Silver has said in the past 10 years, it's hard to find anything that doesn't advocate a Bayesian approach. And I'm sure that there will be some nods from people who are listening, and also some around that. We think then how we take that base and we look at the variation and the folding of that, or the analysis, the way that we might model the computational approaches and the kind of inferential approaches, then we have today these kinds of challenges. So the interesting sort of ways that we're trying to create origami at the moment is through thinking about models being probabilistic or hierarchical, particularly flexible models. So what if we don't really know the model? How do we make it robust? How can we transfer from one system to another system and have a model that will allow us to do that, or a framework? And how do we have adaptive models? In computation, we want our computation to be scalable. We want to be able to have some sort of subsampling. We want to have pre-computable approaches that we might have, so that we can improve our analysis time, our computation time, and also, of course, the approximations that can also speed up our computations. We have inferences. We want estimation, and we go from estimation to optimization, especially in the big data context. We certainly want uncertainty quantification, and in complex systems, this is can be quite difficult, and we're still learning how to both understand that quantification and measure that, but also then about how to communicate uncertainty. And we want our models and our inferences to be learning, so in a way that we can update them often in real time, but also in sort of realistic time as well. And we want to think about model averaging, so taking into account that there can be these different representations of a system, and bringing those different representations together. So the question then is, we have this the variation and the folding, and we want to now go to the product. What's the product and what's the purpose? And that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of time on in our efforts to go from the paper to the purpose. And so the first case study, these are case studies that have been undertaken during the term of ACEMS, and that have involved a number of ACEMS members, as I said. So the first case study is in hunting jaguars, in fact, in creating a jaguar conservation corridor across Peru. And this project involved us actually going to Peru, to 2 locations in the Amazon in Peru. And the idea was, well, where do we actually create this conservation corridor? And you say, well, what's that got to do with statistics? And we say, well, what we want to be able to do is to use our statistical knowledge and the data that we might be able to obtain, to then understand where an optimal placement might be for this corridor. And so that took us then to Peru and to the Amazon. This was the kind of landscapes that we would see. And so we were interested then in what are the features of these landscapes that would actually be more conducive to a jaguar living, hunting and moving through these areas, and how can we incorporate those into a model. So what we did then was take the opportunity to learn about all kinds of data and to incorporate these different sources of data. And of course, for many of us as statisticians now, we are dealing with these data as part of our everyday work. So we might have camera traps, we might have acoustic information or data. We have 360 cameras and virtual reality. We have other kinds of observational data, encounter surveys, drones and satellite images. We also have phone information as well. So these are all the kinds of information that we might have, and we want to know how to put it together. And we're still learning how to do this. So what we ended up with was stars on a map to show about location of jaguar sightings from individuals, from local people. And then we also took 360 images in the forest, and we used this then to show to experts around the world. So we could create virtual reality that we could show to experts and elicit their information about what were the features in these landscapes that would be conducive to jaguars living in and moving and hunting in these areas, and how likely was it that a jaguar would be in that area. So we could take these different kinds of information and then we could quantify that and then use that in our statistical models. So we've taken an origami then, which is our base, which is our data, and thinking about the variation. So we have a statistical model then. We're eliciting this expert information, incorporating it in the statistical models, and we can think about then as a statistical model of imperfect presence data, and we've written about that. You can think about a mathematical model then about the jaguar abundance under different climate variation scenarios, and I'll talk to that in a minute, and also network models. So for example, a Bayesian network model for understanding human-wildlife conflict in conservation. So these are the kinds of outputs or the kinds of products that we've had. So taking a base, varying that, and then creating some kind of outputs, in our case, the knowledge, the new knowledge and the new models for this. So for the stochastic model of jaguar abundance, for example, and this is work that was led by Kevin Burridge, under different climate change scenarios. So here we have 7 parameters, and these will represent the different conditions or different states of a jaguar. So they could be single male, they could be a female with no offspring, a female with a male offspring, a female with a female offspring, or 2 male offspring, 2 male female, or 2 female offspring. And so then we get either a birth, a death, or a cub death, or a split, as you can see here. So we take that then, and we can then create a transition matrix that represents those different states and the different transitions between the states. So a single female, a female with no offspring becoming a female with an offspring, say a male offspring, and so on. And so then we're interested in the probability of birth, adult death, cub death, and a split, where a pair become, or a parent and an offspring then split. And we can update that model via a Towley algorithm. So we can take each time point and update the probabilities and the states as well. So we start with a Poisson distribution with some intensity, and we then look at the value of S here at t equals a particular time, Tn, and then we look at the relative probability of each interaction occurring, and that's going to be given by this vector of the different parameters that we've considered here. And so when we do that, just to show some results, we can see under different scenarios for climate, we can look at then what is that total number of jaguars that we would be able to estimate from this model. And you can see here that the number of animals under current climate and stable prey availability will increase to a certain level, and that will be the sort of based on the amount of land that's available or space that's available. And under drought and flood and drought, so different kinds of climate scenarios, you can see again that there will be a rise to that level and then a drought, but then as the animals recover back to that level and so on. So if there is sort of this climate change, but it is reasonably regular, then that's fine. When we get extreme floods and droughts and they happen more regularly, what we see is that ability to recover fails. And so we may have an increase and then there'll be a decrease. And we'll try to increase again the numbers and then they will plummet. And so we can start to understand from these data the scenarios under which we will have a very vulnerable jaguar population. Now, this is important because we can put this information back into the VR world and we can then create augmented reality that shows what's going to be the implications of these kinds of changes in climate. And then that can be shown to the local people, also to experts and to the public. And we've been able to really push then how we can do this. So for many of us, we work with a product, a statistical product like R. As statisticians, we work with R. And virtual reality is something that is created usually through another kind of product. And so sometimes it's outside our reach to be able to create this. So what we did then was this is work with John Peppink and Julie Versoloni, but particularly for John's master's program and building on Miles McBain's work as well. So taking R and being able to use R to create VR. So this is going from R to VR. And then as statisticians, then we can use R, create our virtual reality worlds or spaces, and then elicit information in the virtual reality world, feed those data back into a database that can be read into R, and then we can do our analysis. So it's a way to link R to VR for people like us, for statisticians, and to open the door of this virtual reality world. So we see this as quite exciting because it means then that we can use this new technology, this virtual reality technology, as an information gathering source, and to then feed the products, the results of our statistical analyses back into the VR world. So what this means then for a purpose, for just coming back to the one example of the work led by Kevin, is that we see that jaguars populations exhibit some robustness to extreme drought and flood, but repeated exposure to these events over short periods can result in rapid decline. And they could return to stability if there are periods of benign climate patterns and other factors are conducive. And so this information then was handed to the conservation organization in Peru and also was shown to various government members in the two areas where we went. And that has created then a particular corridor. So in one area, the government has linked up the different national parks that have been gazetted with a corridor area. And in the other area, they've set up much more stronger monitoring. Now, over COVID, of course, we haven't had opportunity to access these areas, but we believe that this is quite a strong impact from this work that ACEMS has allowed us to do. I want to turn now to a second case study, and this is the Virtual Reef Diver project that was really works done with a team again, led by Julie Versoloni and Erin Peterson here at QUT. And the Virtual Reef Diver project is like this. So we have the Great Barrier Reef that's 2,300 kilometres long. It's a national treasure, and we monitor it quite closely at certain points. So there's 20 years of monitoring by the Australian Institute for Marine Sciences and other groups, but it's at certain points. And the question is, what's happening in between those points? And so what we did then was to say, well, there's any number of divers out there with their cameras, and there's also underwater drones that are surveying different areas. What if we built an virtual Great Barrier Reef, and we allowed divers and organisations to upload images of the coral onto that virtual reef? Then we can go into those images and we can extract information from those. So we can extract information either by using other citizen scientists to classify points in those images that they're as coral or not coral, and then we can take that information out through the back end and incorporate that then as data in our models. We can also use machine learning methods to automatically classify coral in those images, and again take that information out and add it to our statistical models. So here our base is again the data, which are the images that we would obtain from the cameras or the drones. And our models then are going to be the statistical models, the linear models that incorporate that information. And the product that we have then at the end is our online virtual reef diver product. And so what we do then is we go from the data to the product and again to data. So here we have the images coming onto the platform, and then the citizen scientists going into those images and classifying those images, and that's again producing data for us. So we have these different ways of obtaining our data, different types of data that then we're going to be using. So we take a Bayesian approach again, and instead of talking about the predictive model, I want to talk about the way that we think about this citizen science data. And so the citizen science data that we're obtaining, these classifications are going to have potentially errors. So people, the citizens, they're not necessarily experts in classifying coral. And so we need to understand then what's the user accuracy accounting for the difficulty of the images that they might be seeing. So the complexity of the image with respect to, is it just all sand, or is it different kinds of coral and algae and so on. And so the kind of model that we use then is we have this Bayesian approach as our base, and then we have the variant, which is going to be a spatial model, what we call a 3PL model, that's going to estimate the accuracy accounting for the difficulty of the task. And I'll describe this model a little later. But this model in summary is going to be a 3-parameter model: the user ability, the task difficulty, and the opportunity for guessing. And we have a logistic model, so we have 2 outcomes, coral or not. And then this uses spatial information in that images that are closer together will have similar difficulty. So we can borrow strength from the information from other images that are around a particular image to say how difficult that is. Now, again, this is work that's led by Edgar and with a team. And so what we see from this model, and I'll describe the model as said in detail later, but for now, just we find it's a closer fit, so we get a better root mean squared error. We have improved correlations between the estimated and the true difficulties. We have improved prediction accuracy, and we have better estimates as a result. So you can see here, for example, we can identify the users, in the citizen scientists, who are beginners, who are more competent, experienced, or expert classifiers. And so, for example, we could just take our experts and our experienced classifiers and use the information from them. And we can also then provide particular targeted training for our beginners. So that's where we're headed with this. We can also obtain from this analysis then information about the difficulty of the categories or the images. So what we see here is that it's much harder for people to classify soft coral, but it's also very easy to classify sand. And so we get some understanding of where we might need to put support for people to become better citizen scientists. And using this source of information, this citizen scientist, being able to use that as another source of data that we have, but being able to trust it more through these kinds of methods is really important. Citizen science is being used in many areas, but the trust in those data is queried, and this is a way that we might be able to add value to that kind of data. We can also then use that data to learn about reef health, so improve predictions about coral covers, heat waves and cyclones, and also the impact of marine reserves. When we use all of the data, including the citizen science data, we do much better than if we just use the long-term monitoring data. So the planned longitudinal studies that are done. So the long-term monitoring data you can see on the right here is showing the relationship between what we observe and what we predict. And if we use all of the data here on the left, you see that this is much better. So this is work also with our industry partner in ACEMS, the Australian Institute for Marine Sciences. And so this is an example of how ACEMS has really facilitated work between researchers and our partners. You see here the kinds of nuance we get when we use this kind of citizen science data. So at the top we have just when we use the long-term monitoring program data, and then also when we use all of the data, including the citizen science data, we get much better nuance in our predictions here. And also in the standard errors, these are the standard deviations in those in the estimates that we have. When we want to compare then what happens with the people, the citizen scientists and the automatic classifications, what we find is that the machine learning methods perform well, but some of the citizens, interestingly, do better. And we're trying to find now, where is that space in which citizen science data is useful as not only just as a training data set for our machine learning, but as a source of data in and of itself. So there's a boundary around the complexity of the images where people do better, and also around some of the actual citizen scientists themselves that do as well as the machine. And so in some cases then, this will be a very valid source of data alongside our machine learning algorithms. And in terms then of going from the product to the purpose, we can see the impact of the Virtual Reef Diver program and the way that this engages citizen scientists, but also then provides us this much richer source of data. So this brings us then to the purpose. Right, the case study I want to talk about here is one on creating a social platform for collective decision making. So this platform here is around the question of we have a lot of data. This data can fuel a new era of fact-based innovation in corporations and in the society, backing up new ideas with solid evidence. And so that's the quote from last year for the Harvard Business Review. And that's what we would like to have as the promise. But what we see is that there are many challenges in doing that. So we have misinformation. We have the way that we think about new ideas when we see headlines, the way that data can be data-driven decision-making can be really a priority, but there are different ways that we might want to, or that we can do that. So we think about when we go to make decisions on the basis of data, that we have biases when we have a group trying to provide some collective decision-making process. So we can have groupthink, we can have overconfidence bias, we can have anchoring bias, we can have social dominance bias. And this all creates these kinds of issues, siloed information, echo chambers where opinions are reiterated. We have fake news, we have a lack of evidence base, we have one-at-a-time innovation. So all of these kinds of issues that create challenges for the way that we might really benefit from the ability to use social media or social decision making. So what we've done then is we've tried to create a product that allows for people to propose hypotheses about a particular issue and to be able to provide evidence for those hypotheses. So these hypotheses then can be voted then up or down by people, and we can also then add and rate evidence on the basis of that, or to support that hypothesis. So if we do that, then we get two sources of information. We allow people democratically to put up hypotheses, so we avoid the loudest voice in the room, if you like. But then we also allow people to up and down vote that that hypothesis, and we have the information from the evidence. And so what we can do if we think about the up and down votes is this is going to be thought about as a degree of belief in a hypothesis. So then to add the model and the variance to this kind of data that we have, so the data is our base in the origami world, and we're going to have a degree of belief in a hypothesis that we want to be able to estimate. We have these binary votes, and so very simply then we can think about a Bernoulli model where we have this underlying unknown parameter P, which is the degree of belief in the hypothesis. The X's are the up and down votes, and then we can estimate this parameter P as the evidence comes in. And we can also extend this to a hierarchical model if we believe that there are subgroups in our users. And so the picture then, the figure here shows the evolution of that distribution, that posterior distribution around the degree of belief as the information comes in. So we start with a flat line, and then or a uniform distribution. We don't know what the degree of belief is. And then as the information comes in, then we'll be starting to build up and get a better estimate of that overall probability of belief in the system. So what we end up with then are two pieces of information, this degree of belief and this weight of evidence on that hypothesis. And that allows us then to be able to place the hypotheses with respect to those two bits of information. And then we can identify then which strategies have a lot of evidence and are highly weighted in terms of evidence versus those that are not. And then this allows for different kinds of decisions to be made. So if we do that, then we also need to, again, to control for the bias in the weight of evidence. And so we have here different kinds of potential biases, and then the identification of those biases here. So we want to be able to estimate an individual's probability of a response, again, taking into account their rating propensity and the difficulty of the piece of evidence that they're rating. So we can use, again, an item response model that's similar to the model that was described for the citizen science for the virtual reef diver program. So again, this is a graded response model. I'm happy to go through the details later if you're interested. And what we end up with then is going from this online platform, this Better Beliefs platform that we've created, and using that then for purpose, using it for the Department of Defence, using it for the Fire and Emergency Service, and also for hacking health. So this is early days for this product, but it's a way of using different kinds of data to create a product, an online platform, then with a purpose. How am I going for time, Peter?
You've got maybe another 5 or 7 minutes, Kerrie.
Okay, fine.
I'm sure there'll be questions, but you know, I guess if you go longer, there'll be less time for questions. But
about 5 minutes.
Yeah, about 5 minutes is
sure.
fine.
Thanks. So I'll just talk through this last example where we want to go to think about data again, then creating a model to then creating a product with a purpose. And again, this is work that's been enabled by ACEMS with an ACEMS partner, which is the Cancer Council Queensland. And this is work that's been led by Susanna Cram, Peter Bard, Earl Duncan, and other members of ACEMS. So we have here the case studies to create a cancer atlas for Australia. And so we have individuals that we might know about for cancer, but we then also want to know about like the population of individuals in small areas across Australia. So what can we learn about cancer incidence and survival across Australia? So we take what we consider to be our paper in this case as being our cancer data and the location, the GIS locations of those the cancer data. And we then add our variation to that, which is creating our statistical models. So we're going to use digital earth technology to create the product and our statistical models then to provide the framework for describing the cancer data that we see at this small area level. So we put those together then, and we then look at modeling those data to create the product that we want. So here we have cancer cases in a small area, and we can fit a Poisson model to those cancer cases. And that Poisson model will have an expected value. So each area, each small area will have an expected number of cases, and that will be, so that have an observed number of cases then, and then the Poisson mean for that will be μi, and that's going to be modelled through a set of covariates so that are relevant. So that'll be through the xi term there, and then also some spatial, some residual si. Now that residual then is going to be partly spatially structured residual and partly just unstructured residual. So what we want to do then is to capture the spatially structured residual and to use that then to be able to better provide better estimates of that μi that's the target. So what we think about then as that residual term SI is being divided into a spatially structured term UI and an unstructured term EI. So Bisag et al. In 1974 considered this UI term then as being the spatial structure as having a local spatial structure. So each of the UIs then are going to be influenced by the neighbouring spatial residuals as well from the neighbouring areas. So then we can estimate UI as coming from a normal distribution with a mean from the U's around it. So what we end up doing then is having this sort of locally smoothed spatial structure, which creates then this locally informed model across the space. And so this our parameter μi that we're interested in is going to be affected by the covariates associated with that area, plus then some spatial information from the neighbouring areas. When we do this, then we can incorporate that that model and estimate then the μi or the cancer incidence across each of the areas, the small areas in Australia. So there's about 2,000 odd small areas. And we create then the product, which is our Australian Cancer Atlas. So this Australian Cancer Atlas then is an online interactive product that enables us to look at a large number of cancers and the incidence and survival of cancer in each of those 2,000 odd areas. Now you'll notice also that we can see on the right the uncertainty that's also incorporated in those estimates. And so we try to give an idea of like whether this is a real difference from the overall mean, overall Australian average. And these kinds of ways of communicating and incorporating uncertainty is through our statistical modelling. So we've got here locally smoothed estimates through our statistical models and estimates of the uncertainty, and then comparisons between areas and with the Australian average that incorporate that uncertainty. So this product then has been really created some interest. It allows us to look at spatial inequalities for between people who live in city areas and regional areas and remote areas for different cancers. And this is the standardized incidence rate. So you can see here, some of the areas are really high in terms of incidence for people in remote areas. And similarly, then we can look at the survival curves for people in urban areas and people in regional and remote areas. And you can see here that survival is actually worse in the remote areas. And this then can also be quantified in terms of how many premature deaths could be prevented if there were no spatial inequalities. And so this work by Susanna that was and Cancer Council Queensland showed that we can actually demonstrate then how many deaths would have been prevented if we had better or more equitable treatment. And there's no reason why we shouldn't in Australia. So that then led to, and again, the Cancer Council driving this, led to publicity and a change in policy. And so that's then bringing us to purpose. So there was an extra rebate for people in country areas to be able to access treatment for cancer. So we go then from origami to data science, and we have our base. We make a product from that, and this product can have purpose. It can have meaning in its own right. And we've seen then how we make this parallel, hopefully, between origami and statistics, going through these different stages. Now we have one crane, we have one product. But in fact, in our world of statistics, we have many products, and we have many products that have purpose. So ACEMS has really been a real enabler in creating these different products and having a lot of impact. And what we see then is that as we take one crane and we add other cranes, we take one output from ACEMS and we add other output from ACEMS, from all of our members from ACEMS, we end up with something that is not just one product, but actually 1,000 cranes. And that, I believe, has been the real benefit of ACEMS. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Kerrie. I'm sure we're going to have quite a lot of reactions. I've been looking at the questions. So, Kerrie, can you see the questions as well, or do I? Is it best if I ask? I will ask them anyway.
Yeah, you can ask some.
There's one from Richard from the ARDC who asks, it's about the last thing you were just talking about, the Cancer Atlas. Does the Cancer Atlas, hang on, it's just refreshed itself here, consider ethnicity, Indigenous, Asian, European as part of, as well as location?
No, so at the moment, the Atlas, the figures in the Atlas are adjusted for age and sex.
Right.
But what we're doing at the moment is there's the Atlas phase 2, and we're looking at different risk factors at the moment and the impact of those different risk factors, and also then looking at the estimates over time. So this is the next phase that we're working on now. So any comments or any input would be very welcome.
I guess, I don't know about cancer, but, you know, infectious diseases, certainly it seems, for instance, COVID, which is the front of all our minds, isn't it?
Yeah.
That demographics seem to have a lot to do with, you know, people's contact networks and therefore the way diseases
That's right.
appear in different places. So I guess these techniques are expandable in all sorts of different directions, aren't they?
That's right. Yeah, very much so.
Hey, has anyone else got any questions? I mean, most of the other ones in the question box are actually comments. There's one for Nakul. Feels like what you showed might be related to access to healthcare in remote areas.
Yeah, thank you. That's true. And so what we've seen then is very much, even in the response from the government around creating then like a rebate for people to travel to treatment. And so it's very much then the opportunity for good health access to healthcare in remote and regional areas. We see that now too with the pressure you're talking about COVID, Peter. I mean, there's just this pressure on healthcare at the moment in regional and remote areas, and that access is so important.
Yeah. There's one from Suzanne. She says, very interested in the decision platform. Has this been used to consider or reflect on bias in decision makers as well as audience?
Yes, thank you. It's interesting. So Kate Devitt and both Kate Devitt and Tamara Pierce are the real leaders for the platform, Better Beliefs platform, and they're very much in that area, that field of looking at where those biases might be and also how people make decisions. So so what we've been able to do then is to be able to support that through trying to quantify that kind of bias and trying to understand then the differing abilities and the different biases. There's still some way to go with that as well, but good point. Thank you.
There's some other, one person asked, is the atlas really an atlas? I guess that all depends on what atlas actually means. I guess, what do you interpret by the term atlas there, Kerrie?
I believe it's an atlas. It's an online. Well, it depends. Yes, what the question is. So some elaboration would be good. The other interesting thing is that we're now creating a sort of similar product looking at environmental health. So what are the environmental variables and the impact on health? So excess heat or air quality and so on for Australia. And in that context, then it's actually being termed as a strategic planning digital twin. And that's work that's being led by Aidan Price.
I've got to say,
many names.
I personally like the terminology atlas. I thought it was very descriptive, but anyway, okay. Someone says, Jay says, where can I learn more about this project? Are there any opportunities to contribute? I mean, I guess that's great when you get that sort of reaction when you give a talk.
Yeah.
Maybe, Rosanna, can I just ask, this will be, I mean, if someone did actually want to contact Kerrie like that, is there a way to organise that?
Yes, yep, absolutely, Peter.
Right, good. So I guess we keep a record of people's questions, and we can facilitate that. Okay,
yes, that's right.
Thanks. Yeah. We've got a real explosion. So I'll just try and someone says it's a great pleasure to participate in this lecture. Wants to know if you can watch it again. Well, this does get stored on the ACEMS website, doesn't it, Rosanna?
It does, yes.
Yes, so if you go to the ACEMS website. I'm happy to share
the slides as well. Anybody wants.
Thanks, Kerrie.
And most of the work that I talked about has been for the person who wanted some more information. There's some papers on the work as well. So I'm happy to share those, but you'll also find them online.
Someone asks, I guess it's just an example of what you could do, but could you see power line and chemical warehouse locations being added to the Cancer Atlas to look for correlations with disease clusters? I guess that's the sort of thing a bit further down the track, but you're sort of identifying that with regional versus city at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, that's it's very interesting question and quite a complex question. So with the risk factors, then you can certainly look at those kinds of exposures as being potential risk factors. One of the things that you've got to be very careful of course, is lag and what's association and what's cause. So, for example, you might find that there's a particular infrastructure that's close to an area of high incidence for cancer. Just because you've seen the two together doesn't mean that there's a cause, and we have to be careful about cause and association. And also we have to be careful about the association in time. So, for example, most of these cancers have a long lag time. So it's actually what you do. What if you have a cancer now? The exposure could have been, years ago, even 20 years ago. That is mostly responsible for that cancer. So, for example, smoking and lung cancer is a classic example. So you have to be careful about mapping two things contemporaneously and then associating or then asserting cause to those.
Yeah. that's all.
So anybody who's interested in that, I'm very happy to direct to the Cancer Council Queensland for comments, because it's a really important issue and something we do need to be thinking about and talking about, because there's a lot of sort of the area of science communication is also really important. And we see that again, coming back to your point, Peter, I mean, with COVID on our mind in science communication, the way that we interpret our statistical models and the results is really important.
So there's one about the Better Belief platform. Is there a way to protect against up, down votes from trolls, people deliberately trying to mislead?
So it's a good question. We can see in the data where there's been, to some extent, we can see. So if people are only allowed one vote, up or down, and so if you come back on and you vote again, then you'll only be counted as one vote. You need to. We can see some clusters of votes that may be some sort of like consortium, if you want, or some intention, but some of it we can't at the moment. We need to learn more about how to do that, and I'm sure that there are groups that do that much more effectively. We have some good people in our digital media team here, and of course the cybersecurity people know a lot about this as well. So it's an opportunity to build that sort of collaboration with those groups.
Yeah, and I might just mention, Kerrie, as you know, that in ACEMS we've got people who study social networks and this type of thing, and
exactly,
security across the internet. So it's where all these different lines of research come together, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, very much so.
We've got one from Andrew Robinson. A naive interpretation of your quote from Silver could be that frequentism-based modelling is becoming moribund, or perhaps should be. Are there problems that are better tackled in a frequentism-based modelling framework?
Yes, thank you. That wasn't an intended. I think that the two things can live together. So certainly, like, just because Bayesian methods are becoming more popular, then doesn't mean that frequentist methods need to be less popular. I have a certain preference for Bayesian modelling for a number of reasons, but there are certain circumstances where if the frequentist sort of paradigm actually applies. So if, for example, you are in the case where you have like this sort of multiple data sets, and so the Bayesian framework will be conditioning on the data that you've seen. So you could imagine that you're in a situation where that is the frequentist construct is a sensible construct. And you can also think of when you're in a case where you don't have much prior information and you have a lot of data, and what you want are the main expectations, and that's what you want. Then there's not going to be any difference between the results. There's difference in philosophy, but not in the results of a frequentist and a Bayesian approach. When you have smaller sample sizes, or you want something different from your estimates, or more from your estimates, or you have a more complicated model, or you have prior information, then for philosophical or computational or inferential reasons, then you may want to use a Bayesian model.
Okay, if I can add my own, I'm teaching a first course in probability to second year students at the moment, where we talk about this, and for me it's about choosing the best model for the situation, and it does seem to me that these days, with much more complicated estimation going on in that there are many more situations where the Bayesian thinking can be productive. But frequentism is still pretty good for knowing what happens when you spin a roulette wheel many times in a casino or something like that. So I think it's just a matter of using the right model for the right situation.
That's right.
Which is essentially what you just said.
And I think you're right, and it goes further than that too. That we think of often. I mean, we're trained often in our linear models, but there's a lot of machine learning models as well. So the random forests and the neural networks and all of those good tools that are available now. I mean, what we can do is to add, the mathematical and statistical context and perspective on those models, and then also to be able to add those to our toolkits again, so that it can be the best model for the job.
Yeah. Okay. I realise we're going over time, but there seems to be plenty of people interested. And as long as you're okay, Kerrie, I might just go for a few more questions. So, One from Quang, just a very interesting mark. We're looking at the cancer atlas. Liver cancer flips the trend of remote areas having higher incidence. It's everywhere in Sydney and Melbourne CBD. I didn't notice that in the data, but is that something that you've noticed?
Yeah, so there's some very interesting patterns actually, and so this is something that the Cancer Council is trying to disentangle as well. It's interesting because some of it's around access to treatment. Again, somebody pointed that out as well, but also demographics, which is something that you pointed out, Peter, too. So, there can be stories that we could all make up about it, but we should leave it to the epidemiologists to figure out the stories. But certainly what I find interesting about that, and thank you for making that comment, is that the Atlas actually, this product that actually allows us to go to see the data and to be able to observe those kinds of patterns and then to ask questions about them. And so, so it enables all of us to be able to be engaged in that kind of questioning based on the data, and then to be starting to gain some agency over data and data analysis and data interpretation. And I think that that's really important for us. If there's sort of one message, it's about creating that data literacy in our amongst the public, and data agency amongst our public too. That we're not just giving over our data, but we're also able to see what our data's telling us, and then we can also participate in that decision making about the data.
Okay, we've got a few more. Maybe we'll draw a line under the questions that are already in. I'll put them to Kerrie, but I'd appreciate if we don't have any more. If anyone has got any other questions later, please contact Kerrie. I guess she'd be very interested. But one from Peter Steiny. He found the coral reef example very interesting and wants to know if it's been used more widely for incorporating citizen science into physical models, or even just quality control of data.
Yes, very interesting. So there's two ways, just as a more widely as well, geographically more widely. So the Australian Institute for Marine Sciences, we're in collaboration with them, looking at a project on reef cloud, which is extending to other coral reefs in the Pacific. So there's an example of more widely. But in terms of different models, I think it's a really interesting area in the physical models and in quality improvement and quality monitoring, in that there's a lot of expert information, and to be able to extract that and to use that as prior information in a model, and combine it with the data. So you've got the prior information from the experts in the system, and even from other contexts in the system, and then being able to incorporate that in the data with the data in a formalized mechanism. So yes.
So there's a question from an anonymous attendee. I'll read what it says. The Cancer Atlas example mentioned an 80% confidence interval. Were the 90% confidence intervals much wider? And do the stakeholders prefer the lower? I guess you'd point out, Kerrie, confidence interval doesn't actually work in a Bayesian situation, but there's an analog, isn't there? Yeah. So how big were the, if we sort of were willing to be less certain about what was going, we wanted to be more certain about what was going on, do the intervals? I
can't answer that off the top of my head, but I can certainly, I'm happy to talk to the person who made the comment about it. Obviously, those intervals are going to be different, and so but I think the same message will hold.
Right. There's one from our ACEMS Chief Investigator colleague, Kerrie, Robert Cohen. It's just disappeared again. Where's he gone? He said, good work, but this sounds like observational data. Do you follow up with experiments?
Which example is he talking about?
I guess he's probably talking about the cancer, I imagine, but Robert, do you want to clarify? Sorry, Kerrie, you go.
No, ask Robert.
He hasn't said anything.
Okay, so so if it's talking about so going through it, so for the virtual reef diver experiment, so let me just talk about also, even if we have observational data, so maybe in a larger context, if we have observational data, then I agree with Robert that it's really useful to follow up with experiments if we use the observational data to be hypothesis generating, and then we need to create an experiment to be able to verify those hypotheses. That's really useful. But we live in a world of observational data now, and we want to be able to use that. And there's two ways to do that. I mean, we know that we can do some sort of validation of our models and our inferences in a statistically rigorous manner. But also, if we have a lot of data, then what we can also do, and this is work with an ACEMS colleague, Chris Travandi, and some international colleagues, but we can take, for example, a large set of data, and we can think about, if we have a question that we would like to answer, what would be the experimental design that would be best to answer that question? And we can lay that design out over our large data set and then extract the observations corresponding to that design. And then we can also see, and we can use that then as a designed experiment. And if we find, for example, there are no observations at a design point, then that tells us something about the gaps in the observational data, so that's useful. And also we can replicate that experiment by laying out that design over the data many times. So we can actually then get some assessment also of our model fit by doing so, and our experimental uncertainty. So I see that there's some parallel, so there's a way of creating an experiment out of our observational data as well.
Yeah, for what it's worth, Kerrie, I think that's a really important point about, traditional statistics warns us to be very careful about observational data, but on the other hand, quite a lot of people are just using observational data very successfully and getting lots of insight into whatever, and even companies are making heaps of money because they're doing that. So you can't ignore that.
No,
those
absolutely.
things work. Yeah.
No, we need to. We need to. It's like a lot of the data. It's like the citizen science data, observational data. We need to be, we need to be figuring out how to do that well, and that's important.
All right, I'll quickly have to go through just see if there's any others. So people have said you thought you did a great presentation. That's clearly right. Brilliant talk. Yes, lots of appreciation for the talk. One from Jay, have you worked with platforms like Orin for studies in Australia?
Platform like what?
Orin, that's the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network, I believe.
So we're closely connected to Orin for a number of projects, for our environmental health atlas or digital twin project, and that's funded by Frontier SI. And we're also involved in an Australian Urban Health Index project that's funded by ARDC.
Yeah. Okay. And there's a few questions for contact details and also the recording of the meeting. I'll just reiterate. Maybe Rosanna, you can do too. But this has been recorded and will be published on the ACEMS website, and you can find Kerrie's contact details on the ACEMS website as well. So instead of us sending it out to individual people requesting it, it's probably better if you really want to go to our website and you can find the details there. So Kerrie, this has been absolutely fascinating. You've clearly engendered a lot of interest and a lot of interesting questions, and you've taken us a bit of a tour of the things that can be done, and it's been fascinating. So thank you very much. And look forward to, well, obviously I'll talk to you quite soon, but other
Thanks,
people
Peter.
will see we'll see what you're doing.
Thanks, Peter. And again, the acknowledgement is to the co-authors and the members of ACEMS that really did all this work. So thanks to them.
Everyone, thanks for your attendance. It's been great that the number of people that wanted to participate and get involved. So it's been a really good hour and a bit. Thank you.
Thank you.